Hey, it's syndicated radio talk show host, author, singer Al Cole, welcoming you to another edition of People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. I come from CBS Radio. My shows are nationally syndicated, and I've helped pave the way to treating women, guys too, with the dignity that they deserve, and I do that through my show. People of Distinction, aired on top networks, including, you could say, the toppest, Apple's iTunes Radio Network. They air my show, as well as CBS shows, Fox News, NPR, BBC, also C-SPAN, best talk in the country, and around the world on Apple's iTunes Radio Network under News Talk. And I want you to visit my website, peopleofdistinction.org, and there's a lot to see and hear there. You can hear my Apple streams through my station page, and you can see some of the national alignments that I have with people like Ariana Huffington, the founder of the Huffington Post. You can read up on my consulting, major media consulting. I help people to make a profit on whatever products and services that they have. And also you can read up about my People of Distinction, Humanitarian Awards events honoring humanitarian and creative unsung heroes since 2013 in New York City, Capitol Hill, with members of the U.S. Congress. Also, you can email me at alcoholholic@gmail.com. Yeah, now, my CBS Radio listeners came up with that one, alcoholholic. Seems like from day one, my listeners have been saying, Al, we love what you're doing there, brother. And we're hooked on it. We're alcoholics. Coming up, a guy that you're going to love. His name is Ramon Piñon, and he's written a gripping book here, Friction and Fantasy. A lot of my listeners are going to be asking, well, what's that all about? Friction and fantasy? It's about human sexuality. Yeah. And we talk about that on People of Distinction with Al Cole. Now, the second part of his title, the subtitle, is Opening Pandora's Box. Now, we understand about that. See, human sexuality is not something that we normally enter into in polite general conversation. All right, you meet somebody, and maybe for the first time, you're not going to really talk about sexuality too much, because you might be opening up Pandora's box. You get it? Now, we need to open up that Pandora's box if we want to get deep in our relationships. See, honesty is the best policy when it comes down to human sexuality and love relationships. Now we're really talking. When we're talking about love relationships, including love making, now that's where the friction comes in. And also the fantasy. And sometimes you can fantasize about beautiful human sexuality. And other times, it's the reality that we're entering into during lovemaking, during our finest love relationships. Now, I know about this stuff because at CBS Radio, I wrote a number of books dealing with human sexuality as well. The Spirit of Romance and also Romance for Women became bestsellers and talked about how men can please women better, and also sexuality in the broader sense of the word with romance, the romantic relationship that we enter into with life itself. Now, Ramon might be talking a little bit about that too. And in that way, there's a connection between human sexuality and high-level spirituality. Whoa. At that point, we're not only opening up Pandora's box, but we're also embracing everything in Pandora's box, because everything that comes out in terms of spiritual concerns and human sexuality, they're real. They're natural to us. And he's got another book that later on we'll talk about too, Becoming Female and Male. He's talking about energy at that point. Female energy and male energy are the repositories of a single body. Even if your body looks male or looks female, that energy that's all around us that is female and male, now we're comporting with that. And Ramon knows that. And we're going to have a stimulating conversation about energy, love energy, spirituality, and of course, human sexuality. All wrapped into one of those mini spotlight interviews that I give for companies who introduce guests on my show. And we might expand it a little bit more for Ramon because I like this topic, human sexuality. And if you want to order that book, Friction and Fantasy, Opening Pandora's Box, you can order it at Amazon.com. And I will say he was brought to us by Author Reputation Press. And if you got a book you want to move it through authorreputationpress.com. Welcome, Ramon, to People of Distinction with Al Cole. It's a pleasure to have you on today. How are you, Ramon?
I'm fine. Thank you, Al. It was a nice introduction.
Thank you so much. Now, we're going to be talking about it here. Friction and Fantasy, Opening Pandora's Box, from the perspective of human sexuality. Now, you've been involved in that in more ways than one. Everybody who hits a certain age, well, they're involved in human sexuality because we're just made that way. But you've chosen that subject to write about as well. So even before we start to unpack it with your book, Friction and Fantasy, tell us why you chose that topic in the first place to write about. Is that something that you've researched professionally as well?
Well, I taught a course for many years of human reproduction at the University of California in San Diego. And when you talk about human reproduction, you can either focus on the purely biological aspects, or you can focus also, which is what I do in this book, Friction and Fantasy, on more fantasy, because I took the title Friction and Fantasy actually from a statement by Helen Kaplan, who was a psychotherapist in the 1970s, in which she said that sex is composed of friction and fantasy. Well, I think everyone understands the friction part, but the fantasy is what's really, really captivating, because when we think about human sexuality, we have to think of it as from my perspective, it's kind of like a concoction of human culture. It's unfathomable, unbounded, idiosyncratic, and multidimensional. And this is what makes it so emblematic of humans. Mm-hmm. It's just an incredible artifice in a way. And my book is an exploration of all of that from a historical and literary perspective. I have to say, this is not a how-to book, but it's a way of trying to, at least from my perspective, of trying to understand human sexuality the way it has been understood from the beginning of time, or at least from the beginning of recorded history. Mm-hmm. So I many things. I can maybe just if I give you a sense of some of the chapters, because it's so complicated. Ruminations on sex and love, for example. The anatomy of sex, our sexual theater. Erotic preferences and gender diversity. Our disturbing sexual corridors, in which I talk about the questions that arise from the sexual behaviors that are very disturbing, criminal, child sexual abuse, for example, pedophilia, and then sexual discontent and its origins. Mm-hmm. These are some of the topics that I try to cover, all from a historical and literary perspective, trying to trace the way humans have thought about all of these different things through the course of history, many different cultures and so forth.
Well, let's trim it down here, and let's focus on one of those chapters that you just gave us in this spotlight interview, which would be the one that you think would be best for our listeners to know about as far as human sexuality. Which chapter?
Oh, gosh, it's so difficult.
How about the erotic thing that you were talking about? How does that relate to human sexuality in terms of your book, Friction and Fantasy?
Well, the issue there arises from something that people have always wondered about, and that is, what is normal? What is it that? How do we define something which is abnormal in particular with respect to human sexuality? And one of these topics, of course, in modern day cultures, of course, is what I refer to as erotic preference, meaning another way of talking about that is homosexuality versus heterosexuality, and also gender diversity, how those things, what we know about the biology of those aspects, which turns out to be very little. But I talk about the way in which these different aspects of this particular aspect of our sexuality has arisen throughout history. The way in which people from early times have thought about these concepts and how it has changed over these 2,000 or 3,000 years or more. Big issue right now, for example, is the transgender issues. How do we understand the transgender problems that have arisen, and why is there so much antipathy and so much let's say misunderstandings of these aspects of our human behavior?
Well, let me jump in here because my listeners want to know some answers here. Why do you think we have so much antipathy to the transgender direction in life?
I think partly it has to do. We grow up in a society in which we are compartmentalized to two different types, male and female, and we assume that if you're born with male sexual organs, you're going to be male. And the same thing, if you're born with female sexual organs, you're going to be female, meaning you're going to feel female or feel male. And what we've become, we understand now, and I try to review this in the book, that's not the case. For most people, it's true. But there's always a certain fraction of people, and it varies. No one knows exactly what the percentages are. But the gender diversity, that is the idea that organs is not the same thing as the way a person feels about themselves, whether they're male or female, that goes back hundreds or thousands of years. And so it's part of a misunderstanding that somehow we have to force people to be into one category or the other, and that if they're not, then they are in some sense freaks. They're abnormal, and we have to try to fix them in some way so that they conform to what our ideas of being female and being male are. And I think the same thing is true with erotic preference. That is, whether you are homosexual or heterosexual. Again, as far as we know, historically, these things go back. I mean, this is part of what humans have been and are, and we try to force categories on people that our biology just doesn't admit. And the problem, of course, is that we punish the nonconformers, the ones who don't fit into these categories that the culture, the religion, our society sort of imposes on us. And so this is what I try to what I try to do in this particular chapter to review the way in which our ideas of all of these different concepts have changed, have been modified, the way they're slowly changing, but but also the difficulties that still need to be overcome.
Mm-hmm. We get it. On People of Distinction, hey, we talk this way too. We love this. Ramon Piñon, our special guest on People of Distinction, talking about his book, Friction and Fantasy, Opening Pandora's Box, and it has to do with, as you know, human sexuality. And it's available to you on Amazon.com. So run there, order that book, Friction and Fantasy by Ramon Piñon. And I'm going to make a reflection here, as I do, on People of Distinction with a couple of cents of my own here. Now, this goes out to you, my listening audience. Get it. The orgasm of the mind is typically greater than the orgasm of the body. If we're talking about human sexuality, and now particularly maybe something that has to do with taboo, like being a transgender, we're talking about a lifestyle. We're talking about a mental outlook, as well as possibly even a spiritual outlook. We're certainly talking about feelings right now. We're not just talking about, as Ramon pointed out, we're not just talking about the body type. The body type, well, maybe that might look like a male, but see, we can broaden that to understanding the female aspect of who we are too. And I did say who we are. We're talking about something that's endemic in us from birth. If we didn't have institutions that would brainwash us against some of the natural directions that we have as human beings and the directions that our mind takes naturally, we wouldn't have a lot of this confusion. Now, understand how the mind works here. That's what Ramon is talking about or trying to get to. We're talking about a mental outlook where we're not just encapsulated and enthralled for just a 5-minute stint. This is a lifetime thing. And we are now saying, I want to love me. I want to understand who I am. And I want to love the self within me. Self-love is really the pinnacle here to wonderful human sexuality. When you look into your lover's eyes, you could be looking into your own eyes at the same time and stimulating yourself as you look into the eyes of another. And that beautiful energy transformation, that sexual energy transformation, instead of just limiting it to the bodies and kissing somebody's lips, you can kiss somebody's consciousness as well. Understand what really makes them tick and add that to what makes you tick. And as you do that, well, maybe the transgender lifestyle could be seen as, boy, that's natural. And anything that's natural, now we can, when we understand it, we can embrace that. We don't have to ostracize ourselves from it or ostracize them from ourselves. It's a matter of self-love as much as anything else. And self-understanding, understanding that we are bifurcated right from the start into female and male, male and female, energetically, no matter what our body says. And we can explore all different types of lifestyles in order to make us whole. And that's what Ramon is talking about. He's talking about the wholeness of human sexuality, even when Pandora's box says it's taboo. We can still embrace it for the self of that higher power self within us saying, yes, you get it. You are understanding the entirety of life right now. Am I making some sense in what I'm saying, Ramon?
Yes, you are.
Now, carry on that way with another chapter of your book that we want to know about. We've talked about the erotic aspect. What else should we know about friction and fantasy from that point of view in something very explicit that you want to get out to my listeners?
Well, there's one here which I it's always the title of the chapter is "Our Disturbing Sexual Corridors," in which I talk about sexual violence, and I review that, and it's what I come across, what I found out about all of this, sexual violence, of course, I refer to it as an ancient scourge. Rape and child sexual abuse and so forth. These aspects of our this is part of our humanity, unfortunately, that has existed and continues to exist, and we don't know what to do about it. This is why I refer to them as our sexual corridors, because they're aspects of our sexuality that we often don't want to talk about, that we want to ignore, but they persist and they cause tremendous amount of damage, psychological damage, physical damage in our society. And this was a difficult chapter for me to write. But I think it's part of our sexuality. We can't ignore it. We can't. This is not a Pollyanna type of world. And so that's a chapter that I had a hard time writing, but I think it's a very valuable addition. It's part of who we are.
Right. Okay, so order the book here, people. Friction and Fantasy, Opening Pandora's Box. If you like what Ramon is talking about, he's the author. Ramon Piñon, special edition here of People of Distinction with Al Cole, and you can order that at Amazon.com. We have some minutes left, and let's talk just a little bit about another book that you have, Becoming Female and Male. Now, that's provocative stuff there. And it really is an extension of what we've already been talking about, maybe with some of the other aspects of transgender and maybe gay, maybe lesbian, and all of that stuff. What did you mean to say when you wrote the book Becoming Female and Male, Ramon?
Well, the subtitle to this book is Our Extraordinary and Perilous Journey. And this is a focus on our biology from the time that are the X and the Y chromosomes. I talk about those things, about the way in which the sperm is produced, the egg is produced. So let me just give you a little sample here. Our pre-birth journey, for example, which is way before. Then the post-pubertal female, I talk about the reproductive tissues of the female, ovulation, the way the egg is made, and so forth. Menstruation, the menstrual cycle. I talk about the post-pubertal male, of course, the tissues, the testes, the hormones. I talk about puberty. I refer to the enigma of puberty because it's something which is very, despite how much we've studied it, it's still an enigma. And then, of course, I talk about our reproductive twilight. In the female, the menopause. In the male. That's one. There's several of those chapters. Our prenatal, early postnatal life. I talk about pregnancy loss and birth defects, something that weighs heavily on us, because anyone who is hoping for a baby, we want the best thing to happen, to the happy outcome, but all of us know that things go wrong. And question is, why do things go wrong? What are the factors that result in having birth defects? What are the categories of birth defects? So these are some of the topics that I talk about in this book: infertility and assisted reproduction, contraception, birth control. All of these are the things that I talk about in this book. Again, it's also has a historical and literary perspective. Not only it's trying to meld the biology, what we know of the biology, and the way in which over many hundreds of years human societies have come to understand these different processes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so both of them are companions on Amazon.com. You can order both on Amazon. Friction and Fantasy, Opening Pandora's Box, and Becoming Female and Male. Also on Amazon, our guest, Ramon Piñon. Ramon, we're coming to the end of the show. I want to cap it off in the last few minutes with some possibility thinking. I like to end a lot of my shows with possibility thinking. It's a way to encapsulate both the information and particularly the inspiration of any interview in terms of what if. What if whatever my guest was talking about, in positive terms, came to pass in our human family future? What would that look like in our world? And I'm going to put it this way. When we do understand in some of the ways that you're talking about in your book, Friction and Fantasy, and also Becoming Female and Male, when we as a society open up Pandora's box and there's nothing there. In other words, we are now understanding all of human sexuality. Whatever is natural for us to have understood in the first place. Now we understand it. We understand the friction and the fantasy. We understand becoming female and male, and there's no more taboo about it. At that point, 5 years from now, 10 years, 20 years from now, 50 or 100, in terms of our human development into the future, if we do understand all of these, what kind of world is that going to look like at that point, Ramon, that it doesn't look like now?
It'll be unimaginable.
Okay.
We can't say, but it's going to be better than it's ever been.
Mm-hmm. All right. And I will add a little meat and potatoes to that of my own here. A couple of cents of my own to cap off the show here. It'll become the world that you already know exists within your human sexuality, that you've never been able to really express, except every once in a while with your deepest love relationship, and then particularly with yourself. Now, this is what I mean, people. We all are born babies. All right, so we know that. And that baby comes out and says, wow, life, I'm here. Thank you for inviting me, and I've made it. That's the greatest blessing in the world. And that is a love blessing. After that blessing, society gets a hold, and with its institutions, it kind of pigeonholes us into something that we might rebel against. But we don't want to rebel too strongly or too loudly on the outside. We rebel against ourselves. And it develops self-hatred in many cases. It develops guilt within us. It develops resentment within us that we have to hold all of this in. And then sexuality gets it out there, sometimes in spurts where, hey, we're just sleeping with somebody. And we're not really thinking of that person as a person. We're not thinking of that individual as a mind source. We're just thinking of the body at that point. And we're wondering how come we're not fulfilled? Hey, because every once in a while, now we have to learn how to make love with others and make love with ourselves. That is the key to friction and fantasy. That's the key to becoming female and male. even though there are a whole bunch of different chapters that explain it in different ways. But the People of Distinction way is it's already there within you. It's there for you to understand if you understand yourself. Take a little bit of alone time, people, and don't be afraid to touch yourself every once in a while. Now, that's the fantasy. Don't be afraid to actually engage in anything intimate with yourself, because the self is the first place of consciousness within you. That's the first relationship that you really have with life itself. That is you. That's your intimate territory. And if you explore that within you, and you don't have to be kinky about it, you can explore that even in a scientific way. I wonder what it feels like to do this. I wonder what it feels like to do that. I wonder what it actually explores in terms of the spirituality and how it merges with your religion and how it merges with your educational background. How human sexuality touches every part of who you are on the inside and the outside too. The way that you think, whatever you've studied, your vocation, even if you're a real estate agent, the becoming female and male, the friction and the fantasy lives within you, and you are the repository of all of that knowledge. Now, guess what? You create your new society that way. When you are honest with yourself from whatever you've gathered from your feelings, whatever you've gathered from your self-exploration of human sexuality, and then you share it with others, that special other, and that other is telling you, that female or male, is telling you, wow, you're good. Yes, you've learned something that now you're teaching me sexually. Now you have confidence, and maybe you can even talk about it. Maybe you can get out there on the speaking circuit and start talking about human sexuality that way and be convincing and convince others to go down that alleyway. Guess what? Now we're creating that new society that we talked about in possibility thinking. Yeah. We're creating that new society. We don't have to wait for somebody else to create it. We don't have to wait for our institutions to create it because most likely they never will. But we can create it within our own mastery of our own individual sexuality because we're humans. And I guarantee you that whatever you're feeling within you sexually, whatever you explore within you sexually, it's going to be explorable and feelingable within every other human being on the planet because we're just made that way. Human beings are human beings. Human beings come out of the same mold. So you're not doing anything that should even approach Pandora's box in the end. That is the illusion. Pandora's box is the ultimate illusion. The reality is the love within you. If you think of sexuality as love, if you don't, well, now you're going down the wrong alleyway and you could hurt a lot of people, including yourself. And many people do that. But if you think in terms of human sexuality as another way to express love in this world, now you're going down the right alleyway. And I think that you're going to enjoy reading Friction and Fantasy and becoming female and male thereby. And that's why we like to have people like Ramon Piñon on People of Distinction and talking that People of Distinction way, particularly about human sexuality. One more time, order that book at Amazon.com. And one more time, it was brought to me by Author Reputation Press. For your book needs, you gotta get in touch with authorreputationpress.com. Thank you, Ramon, for being my special guest on People of Distinction with Al Cole. It's been a pleasure, and we wish you all the best with your books. Thank you so much.
The pleasure has been mine, Al. It was great. I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to have this interview.
Well, thank you.
I enjoyed it.